This is the Unit 1 test review. There are 4 modules in Unit 1. The first one is the introduction module that just talks about some of the basic ideas of what programming is and how to navigate an ear sketch and how to use the different pieces. Most of this should be pretty easy for you guys because you've been using ear sketch so often that really navigating an ear sketch should not be a problem at this point. You should know how to run things, you should know how to play things. So you shouldn't have to do too much of studying with this. So you can almost kind of just glance through this material. So remember in Lesson 1, we talked about setting up some first lines of code. We talked about why should we learn code. What's the importance of learning an ear sketch? In Lesson 2, we talked about what is programming, a set of instructions for a computer to follow. You have to be careful to make sure you're not giving vague instructions. The computer can only do exactly what it's told. And then finally, we got to our first sketch in ear sketch where we actually made some music and go ahead and recorded that. Then we had our quiz. So one of the things I would do if I were you is look over your quiz results. You should have access to those quiz results, and you can kind of take a look to see how you did, and you can see what things you got wrong, and maybe that'll give you a clue as to what you need to go back and study a little bit more. In Module 2, we started talking about the fundamental pieces you need to build a program and also to build a song. The first thing we talked about was rhythm. So in this lesson, you probably want to go back and dive in and look at the different kinds of rhythms there are, how rhythm it works. Just scroll through the video that's there. Maybe take a look at the exit ticket again. They're all redoable, so you can go back and retry that if you want. But some of the important things that we talked about in this is the number of beats per measure. We talked about 4/4 time. There's 4 beats in every measure, and each of those beats is a quarter note. We talked about tempo in this, and we talked about 120 beats per minute is the standard tempo of ear sketch, and we talked about making that faster by just changing the set tempo command. We also talked a little bit about time signature and the math behind that. If you do 3/4 time, we know that is 3 beats for 4 quarter notes in a single measure. We also talked about data types inside of ear sketch, as well as data types inside of everything. You have our number data types. So I will go back and look at those number data types. We have integer and we had long. You don't have to know the specific size of them, but you do have to know which one's bigger. Why do you need a long? We talked about double, about a decimal value, which is called float. We talked about constants. They're not really types, but there are ways of identifying variables that don't change their value. We talked about strings, collections of letters together, or any type of character. So I will go back over those and make sure you know the different types there are in coding, the different types of things, specifically the number types, so that way you don't get confused on the quiz. So go back and study those. Again, I would look at the exit ticket. You could also take a look at the practice in here, but more specifically, the exit ticket will go through and remind you of those different types. You might want to click on the video and scroll through just to find your notes on your different types if you didn't take very good notes in the beginning. This is a good chance for you to go back and kind of beef up those notes and help you understand a little bit more. I also have the notes link there. So you can go through and look at the different data types. So we can see we talked about numbers, strings, constants, booleans. I won't go through all of this, but you can go through and study this. And again, I won't ask you the size. You just have to know which is bigger, which is smaller, long, float, regular, doubles. Complex numbers, like I said, was not going to be on the quiz. It was just there, so don't worry about complex numbers at all. Okay? Lesson 3, we talked about functions. There are several functions that are built in. We went through and played with those different functions and talked about what those different things did. We had round, absolute value, hex, power, sum, type, sorted, range, and input. Those are all the different functions we looked at. If you want to go back and review what each of those functions does, you can go in and look at the notes page. Again, all these questions will be multiple choice. So for example, there's an example of what round looks like. Just probably refreshing your memory will be enough to remind you. You don't have to sit down and memorize everything because it is multiple choice. So just enough to kind of remind you of what things do. I wouldn't worry too much about the hex. I don't think I'm going to answer a question on the hexadecimal because we don't really do that much with it in this class. Sum's a good one that we looked a lot at. Type, sorted. We also talked about lists, which was another thing, another object, creating a list, because that's important to be able to use sorted, and sum, you have to have a list to work from. So that's what we did in Module 2, rhythm, data types, and functions. Again, I would look at the quiz, look at the results, see what you got wrong, and then that'll give you an idea of what you need to go back and really pay attention to when you're studying for this. Those quizzes are meant to be helpful in guiding our understanding as we get to the final section. All right, so let's move on and take a look at Module 3. This was our debugging section. How do we go through and find errors in code? We talked about Grace Hopper. We talked about where bugs come from. We talked about how to use the console. And we also talked about documenting code. So let's dive in and take a look. So lesson 1 was pretty much all that information about Grace Hopper. And what are different types of errors you could have. We talked about logical errors. We talked about compiler errors, syntax errors. We had that listing of different error types that you would have to be able to classify your errors. So runtime errors, program starts to run but halts during an error. Logical errors, the program runs but it doesn't do what you expect it to do. So maybe your volume is wrong but everything works properly. And you debug your program using the console. We also talked about comments and documentation. Jump over to there. So first, this is our errors, console errors and solutions. I'm not going to ask you to kind of go through and list every detail about this, but you do have to know some of the common errors. Specifically, like the name error, indentation error, index error, name error I said, parse error. I think people are confused on the difference between the name error and parse error, so make sure you get that. Syntax error. This is the one where I said we don't have to worry too much about it. We're not going to see it very often. Type error is when you're using the wrong type for data. Value error is another one where I said we're not going to worry too much about because we really haven't done much with this applying different values, but it's when you use a parameter in your function that doesn't really fit. So those are your different types of errors that you have to pay attention to. Part 3, lesson 3, was documenting code. The two important pieces that we talked about in this is using good comments, but only using comments where necessary. Don't over-comment your code. Make the use of good variable names and good function names. If you have a good variable name and a good function name, then you don't really necessarily need to comment everything. You should be able to read the code through the commands. So for example, if you're using a set effect, all of the parameters of the set effect could be variables, and those parameters could make a lot of sense, like, starting measure, ending measure, beginning of envelope, end of envelope, maximum value, minimum value, starting value, ending value. Whichever you want to use for your variables, as long as it makes sense to the reader as they're going through the commands. If you're just looking at a bunch of numbers inside of a command, that's not really helpful. You're not quite sure exactly what that means. And then maybe if you have several set effects that are working together to create a single sound on a track, there might be useful to have a single comment above all of that to say, the net effect of the following 3 lines is to do X, Y, Z. Just to kind of summarize what everything's doing, so the user doesn't have to figure that out. So we also talked about the APIs. The only one you're responsible for is EarSketch. We did mention the other APIs, but there's nothing in there that you have to memorize or study about the APIs. The idea of using those other APIs was just kind of understanding the relationship between EarSketch and Python. EarSketch is an API. It's an application programming interface that sits inside of Python. Somebody wrote a whole bunch of code for you to use to do all this stuff. There are other APIs. There's APIs for Google. There's APIs for Tinder. There's APIs for Flickr. All these other APIs allow you to use Python to interact with these larger applications. So you can write code to make things happen. Finally, Module 4 is probably the most challenging out of all of the modules because we really started getting into some complicated code. So we talked about the set effect function, and then right after that we talked about envelope. So if you put the two together, really being able to use set effect in its full, using all 7 parameters, is what you have to know how to do. Realize that set effect, multiple sets effect, can apply to a single track. Sometimes you need multiple set effects in order to get the actual effect that you want. Like for chorus, one might set the cutoff value, the other one sets the number of voices. So that way, those two go together hand in hand. If you don't set all of the available parameters for a particular effect, there's a set of defaults that goes in. So it's not like there's nothing. Some basic set of defaults goes into that set, and you just have to live with whatever's there. So I would make it a habit of trying to go through and use all the set effects. When you're using the envelope, you have a starting level, a starting measure, an ending level, and an ending measure. Those 4 extra parameters get added into the set effect. Actually, 3 extra parameters. The first one we used, the starting level, turned it out to be our ending level when we first learned set effect. It applied to the entire track. But using envelopes now does a starting level, a starting measure, an ending level, and an ending measure. So we're adding that into our set effect. So these 3 lessons here, 1, 2, and 3, really go together. We talked about the basics of the set effect function. We talked about all the different kinds of effects that there are. So I'll go back through that list and take a look at them. There's a specific link in Lesson 2 that will open up in EarSketch and go through and explain every single available effect. So if you just open that up, we can see here there's a link. If it doesn't show up, you have to click on this little book here. It says Curriculum. And then it'll show up on the right-hand side. And if you want, you can just drag this over because this is what you're looking at. And then that way you can kind of scroll through and see all the different tables and all the different effects. Again, this is not a matter of memorizing. I don't want you to memorize this stuff. This is a matter of being familiar with it so that way you can answer a multiple choice question. So I might ask you a question about bandpass, but I'll give you all of the information you need. So I'll say the bandpass frequency I want is, I don't know, maybe it's 800, and I want it to start at measure 1 and end at measure 10 with a frequency of 700, and I'd like you to write the set effect command that will make that happen. So that includes the effect, it includes the envelope, I tell you what the parameter is, so you can kind of figure out from the question all the different pieces of information you need, and you'd have to write the effect that would make that happen. Finally, you have lesson 4, where we talked about the different types of transitions. So in here, really we're using the set effect again. We're not really learning any new code here. This is a matter of effectively using the code to build a song. You don't want the sudden transition from one pitch to another pitch. That shouldn't just change pitch. It should be followed along in the music with some type of transition. And we listed the different kinds of transitions that we could have and had some examples of those. So tempo we defined. Here's our different tempos. Pitch we defined. Here's information about pitch, all the stuff we talked about. And then here's our transitions. So we can do a cymbal crash. You can do a reverse cymbal crash. You can do some type of drum fill. You can do a track dropout where the sound drops out from one of the tracks just to make that transition. We talked about a melody variation where you use the same sounds, but there's a slight change in melody. In fact, there's specific folders that do that, and there's one of those listed here, the UK House ARPLEAD. A riser, this is a sustained note. I think this is the one people had the most difficulty understanding. It's a sustained note, something that gets louder as you go across to build suspense. One of the best examples I can think of it is in 2001: A Space Odyssey. They kind of just drag out this really long note to make an effect in the movie where they're just kind of going from one thing to another, and that just long drug out note really kind of builds anticipation and gets to the point where people are ready for something to happen. You know, or think about the old beginning of the different movies with the lion in the front. You know, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. So they're kind of just building it up and building it up to get you to a point. So that's your point in your transition. Something where the sound rises in intensity or in volume or in pitch. There's some type of lifting to the music. And this is just a summary of everything in that lesson. So that is all 4 modules. Again, I would practice and make sure you get your summative project done. And you can look at the summative quizzes, go back through and take a look at those. Go through this video more than once, pull up your different notes through all these different things, go over and study the specific things I said you should be studying for this. It is going to be a multiple choice test mostly. There will be some short answer, but any of the short answer questions I give you, I will give you all the information you need to write the commands. So I'm not going to ask you to come up with an effect. I'll tell you the effect. I'll tell you the parameter I want you to affect. I'll tell you the name of the song that I want played on the track. You just have to effectively write the code that would make that happen, either using the set effect command or putting the music on the track. All right, so that's it for the review.